Join me today on Touring Backroads, France, as we visit 3 Templar commanderies along the trade route in southwestern France. In an area known as Charente, a multitude of sites remain from the time of the Templars. Some are in ruins, some are historical monuments, while others are active churches or have even been bought and restored as private homes. Today I'll take you to 3 sites, traveling from west to east. First, Beauvais-sur-Matha. Then, a few miles down the road to Barbezières. And finally, to an interesting village called Villegâts. Each of the 3 sites presents different elements from the history of the Templars, and finding detailed or precise information about them isn't always easy. While the history of the Crusades and the time of pilgrimages to Jerusalem gave rise to the Knights Templar, allowing them to fund and protect Christian pilgrims for over 3 centuries, their legacy made them too powerful in the eyes of the French monarchy and the Catholic Church. If legends persist about their demise and the disappearance of their treasures, what we can still see today are the vestiges of their bases of operation. Highly organized, efficient, and dedicated, the Templars left the innovative legacy of a unique brand that in many ways was far ahead of its time. For today's trivia question, how many crusades were there to the Holy Land between 1095 and 1291?
Right now I'm in Beauvais-sur-Matha, which is a Templar commandery site right on the border of Charente-Maritime and Charente, on the road from La Rochelle in the area called Saintonge, which is close to the Roman town of Saintes. This is a Templar church site which is originally from the 11th and 12th centuries, and then it was transferred over to the Hospitallers in 1312 after the Templars were basically all arrested and sentenced to death. And what remains of the original church is actually this part here that you see off to the right, and you can see that it has some typical characteristics of Templar church structures. We tend to recognize them. What we notice with these Templar churches is the rounded arches and the setback doorway with the columns next to it. And this one doesn't seem particularly ornate. There are no sculptures or decorations in the bottom part. The top one we do notice look to be sort of flowers or geometric symbols etched in with the same setback in the top arch, and then you notice the pointed arches which are just off to each side in a sort of trinity setup. So this is sort of the basic framework of architecture that would become later common in the Gothic cathedral styles, which are known for their pointed arches and flying buttresses. This church is clearly older because it has the rounded arches. It's a very dense structure inside. It's very dark. The walls are very thick, so you can tell that it was built with a fortress defense in mind. And then south of here, the large area of property, which is now all private property, was the Templar commandery, of which there are very few remaining parts and some conflicting information about what is actually left. Some sources here locally that are posted in town say that there's literally nothing left except just one outbuilding, whereas other sources that I found online tend to point out that there might be actually a well and some underground access tunnels and some bones that have been preserved. Of course, I would imagine these are all on private property, so I'll have to try and dig to see if I can get any information on those elements, whether or not they're left here. But whereas there are some ambiguous elements to the site previous to the 13th century, it's there that we start to have really the first physical documents and historical accuracy that can point to individuals within the Knights Templar as participants of this commandery structure. Previous to the 13th century, there's not a lot of historical information that's deemed accurate about this Templar commandery. However, starting in the 13th century, particularly in 1249, we start to have the first elements that have been historically verified that show that there was a list of commanders in this commandery site that would, of course, been attached to the larger sort of chain of commanderies that led from La Rochelle and down into the Dordogne area, as well as the north-south trade route from Paris down into Spain. And that's why the Templars had so many sites in this particular part of Charente. So this was part of that. So this site is sort of interesting because there are official dates and unofficial dates. And we would start with 1151 as a date where we can't really verify the information about this site. We think it was here, we think it was active, but there's conflicting information when you actually go into the document sources. And I have looked up a lot of the information about this site. I found nothing in English for the moment. Everything is in French language, either locally or online. Some of the posted signs here in town do talk about the Templars. Everything is in French. There's no translation of anything. And the first official date is 1231, early to mid 13th century, where we know that the brother Eli was cited as a witness in some Templar documents referring to other commandery sites, and he was based here in Beauvais-sur-Matha. So we know early 13th century the site was already active along the trade route between the Atlantic coast and the present-day Dordogne, which was the east-west route that the Templars protected. And then you also have the north-south route from Paris down to Spain, which was critical also for the Templars. This was sort of a crossroads for a lot of their activity in Western Europe, and particularly the trade routes. And there are documents that refer to financial transactions, referring to different amounts paid for items at this site. So we do know there is confirmed historical accuracy that this was a Templar site. The addition, which has sort of a different colored stone off to the left here, this was added in the 14th century after the Templars disappeared and the church passed over into the hands of the Hospitallers and the Sacred Order of Jerusalem, which took over from the Templars after their disappearance. So in 1295, William the Short, Guillaume le Court, has some records of different payments being made for items in this Templar commandery here in Beauvais-sur-Matha. So we know that there are some actual verified historical records from that time period. And of course, just a couple of decades later, the Templars were removed from the Catholic Church and the monarchy altogether. So these sites were then given to the Hospitallers and the church, often to different parishes, depending on the larger communities surrounding them. This one actually added on the structure that you see here, the tower that's off to my left, is actually a part that was added in the 14th century. It had a pointed stone rooftop, which collapsed in the 18th century. And then this is actually a site that you can still visit. There is a piece of stone here on the ground, which I wonder if that is not part of the original top stone of the capstone of the pointed roof. It's possible that it's been here for a couple hundred years, just left there. But anyway, this site is in relatively good condition, and you can actually go up and visit the bell tower when it's open to the public. So there's definitely some interesting things to see here. A key date for this site is 1910. That's when it became a historical monument. Early 20th century, it was recognized as an important historic Templar site. It's still here today. You can still visit. So this is really an interesting backroad site. It's certainly somewhere that you would have to look up and try and find to get more information about. And of course, in English, there isn't really much available. I sourced all the information on this site in French, and even locally, nothing is translated. So you do really have to go through a number of different channels, at least linguistically, to get information about this former Templar site in Charente. So this Templar commandery site is called Barbezières. It's about 5 miles east of Beauvais-sur-Matha. This was a known commandery site starting in the year 1080, when this church was actually given by the Abbey of Saint-Amand-de-Boix. And that's unusual for one main reason, which is that the Knights Templar was very hesitant to work with the secular clergy. They wanted to sort of create their own order of very devout and very fierce crusaders, warriors that controlled both trading and sort of a mercenary knight's role. And the secular order of the church was not really in agreement with that. So they tended not to take support from the secular clergy. However, this site, as well as Coulanges, which we visited in the previous episode, are actually sites that were given by the Abbey in Saint-Amand-de-Boix, which was a secular order and had been for several centuries before. So what's interesting is that this site sort of let the Templars establish themselves in this part of Charente, fortifying this west to east route inlands from the Atlantic coast as a primary trade route that would join up with the north-south route to Paris and Spain. So these were essential commandery posts that sort of secured the Templars as they were going inland from the Atlantic Ocean and the harbor of La Rochelle. Now, this site also has English on the posting on the wall, so it is definitely a confirmed Templars site that has been translated into English. Obviously, the information isn't as detailed in English, but at least you get a sense that this was a Templar commandery, and most of this church was destroyed during the 100 Years' War. So what we see here is actually just the remains of the Templar site, which is why we might think it doesn't really have the character that we would see in some of the old historical monuments. So this site is a little bit different from the other Templar sites that we're visiting in this episode in that respect. Obviously, the outlying areas and buildings have changed so much over the centuries that it's very difficult to really get a sense of what the site would have been like about 1,000 years ago, 900, 800 years ago, up until the disappearance of the Templars in 1312. So we have to rely on historical documents, of which there really aren't that many. And what is available is often either in Latin or in French. And we have to go through a sort of process of translation to really understand how to interpret those documents and what they signify.
The commandery site in Villegâts is privately owned and has been restored only recently. In an effort to build community ties and allow people to visit the site, the owners organize gatherings in the summer as well as every September for an open house to celebrate the Cultural Heritage Weekend, which is a French tradition. The buildings here are well preserved and intact, with a chapel, housing, hospital outbuildings that the Templars used for the sick and wounded, as well as stables. It's interesting to observe the stonework, the way the walls are built and have been modified, with blocked off doors, and an additional guard tower that has been restored, as well as much more. Spending the evening here and mingling with the crowd is a fun activity and a totally different way to enjoy the site. Assemblies such as this bring life back into the locations of the Knights Templar and are a unique opportunity to visit these places in a totally different context. Clearly, the local population takes some interest in the history of the Knights Templar, as across the region, sites continue to be protected from encroachment and modern buildings. The answer to today's trivia question is there were 8 crusades to the Holy Land from the end of the 11th to the end of the 13th centuries. This is generally the accepted number put forth in historical sources. In upcoming episodes, we'll visit the harbor of La Rochelle, home to the Templar merchant fleet, and continue to research some of the other places in southwest France. If you haven't already, check out some of my other videos about towns and festivals in this part of France. There's a wealth of culture and history around here, and it's worth looking into. As always, if you like the content of this episode, please subscribe to my channel. Your support is greatly appreciated and encourages the production of future videos.